Okay, so in Premiere now, we're going to take a look at some audio features and hopefully save you a load of time in your edits. And it's worth mentioning as well that Premiere is starting to pull in some more advanced audio features from Adobe Audition, although still there's not much of a case for staying in Premiere if you're doing all of your audio, other than perhaps you're just not familiar with other programs. So I would personally like to go into Logic for using its music functionality, its virtual instruments, and its MIDI capabilities for scoring original music. Or I might prefer to go into Adobe Audition for its very powerful restoration and noise removal features. Although some of those features are now brought into Adobe Premiere Pro, for those of you who just want to stay in Premiere for now, maybe you're in the first year, you haven't spent much time learning the other programs and there are reasons to dip into those, or you're just not comfortable at this stage. So we're going to see what Premiere can do completely native to Premiere, so we don't need to go into other applications. There's quite a few features that are hidden away that I think people just don't quite know they're there. So let's have a look. One of the most powerful features Premiere has that people don't use is the ability to sync the audio files automatically just by using the waveform comparison between the scratch audio from the camera and externally recorded audio from a recorder. So here I've soloed the scratch audio, so that will sound quite poor because it's on the camera. Let's have a little listen.
Her secret from us for 8 years. Her very existence defies Gulhatan. She must be.
Whereas if I solo the external audio, it should be of higher quality, but it won't necessarily be synced.
Secret from us for 8 years. Her very existence defies Gulhatan.
So we need this audio to pull up to our scratch audio without having to spend a load of time manually dragging and dropping clips around the timeline, because that is a huge expense of time. All we need to do is highlight all of the audio clips, including the scratch audio clips, and simply right-click when highlighted and go to Synchronize and set the point to be audio and set the track channel to be your scratch audio track. Press OK, and that will basically pull your files into sync, and that will save you a huge amount of time manually dragging clips around the timeline. And also, it means that if you haven't quite figured out timecode, you can still sync up automatically. And timecode, by the way, will only work with cameras that have the SDI or the BNC input to accept that timecode sync from an audio recorder that is set to generate timecode. So that is really handy, very fast, seamless, and it should work across a high number of clips, although sometimes there's issues and you need to go through them more one by one if you have particular problems. That being said, another very common issue we have is audio being on just one side of the stereo image. Perhaps it's just on the right side or it's just on the left side. Perhaps you've boomed into input 1 external of the camera and input 2 has had no mic connected, or vice versa. So you've got audio on one side of the camera only. It's not necessarily a mistake, it's just something that we have to correct so that we have all of our audio in a stereo image, nice and center for the dialogue. Particularly dialogue needs to be nice and centered. So Basila Samin has very kindly donated this footage to me so that I can demonstrate it to you in this workshop, because it is all on the right side of the clips. And I'm going to show you probably the fastest way to balance this out is to select all of the clips, right-click, and you want to go to Audio Channels, and you set the left and right side of your clip to be pulling from the right of the channel. And as you can see, it duplicates the right side across on the left side as well. And now, if I was to play the clip,
team's losing, mate.
You hear it in mono, whereas before, you only would have heard it in one ear. So that's a really handy way to do that. Another way to do that that you may not know of is by using the audio track mixer, which you should be able to see nice and clearly if you've got audio selected up in the workspaces. I like to just demonstrate switching workspaces so that you're aware of how easy it is to go between different editing modes. Perhaps you're doing some coloring in the editing view, or you go back to audio and you've got all of your audio settings there. So you can be quite confident with these, and you can edit your own workspaces and you can make custom workspaces as well. So very handy. And of course, you know, you can drag and drop tabs around and you can have them appear in different places. That being said, here's a great way to apply an effect and to make a change across an entire audio track. Audio 1 here, let's just say that's the dialogue. Let's call it DX dialogue. Usually you have your dialogue tracks first. You might have dialogue 1, 2, 3, 4. You might have effects 1, 2, 3, 4. AMB for ambient backgrounds, usually stereo files 1, 2, 3, 4, and then music as well. We want all of our dialogue tracks to have centered audio here. So in the audio track mixer, there is this tiny triangle here that expands to show us the effects, which is really useful. You might be used to applying effects in this way, where you type in, let's say you want dynamics, or you type in an effect that you want for audio and it appears, or you manually just search it here. But actually, it is smart to apply them through the track mixer view in the effects slots, which are the first 5. These are sends, don't worry about these yet for now. In the effects slots, there is an effect under special that is fill left with right. Essentially, it does what it says. It fills the left channel with the right side. So now if we play it, even though it hasn't actually duplicated the wave across there on the clip, it will actually play in stereo centered. So that's another way of doing the same thing. Now, these recordings are kind of noisy. You can see the signal to noise ratio is quite extreme there. You've got a lot of noise in the noise floor and the signal is just peaking. That might be the dialogue or the sound effects are peaking out of the signal. So Audition has great noise removal features, and some of these are now starting to appear in Premiere. So the adaptive noise reduction is a very powerful tool that will enable us to try and fix this noise and make it sound better. Now, notice that I've put that towards the top. Noise removal is always an effect that you want to have on at the start of your effects chain. So just double clicking the effect brings it up into its component view, you can say. And also you get this sort of individual parameter view down here, but that's not really a great way to work, I find. It's just a bit clunky. You can bypass the effect there if you need to, but I always like to double click, go in here, and you've got full control of the effect. Presets are a great way to help you get to grips with the parameters of an effect and what happens when they change. So in this case, for example, if you select light noise reduction, you get certain values for those parameters, and they will change if you go to the more extreme preset. So in this situation, because we've got a fair bit of noise, I'm going to try the heavy noise reduction, and I'm going to play through that, and hopefully it should get rid of a lot of that background noise now. So let's just give this a playthrough, and we'll see if these sound effects and dialogue pieces clearly differentiate from the background noise now.
Team's losing, mate.
So you can hear the effect of changing these parameters, and you can quite easily go too far with effects and you end up just completely killing the sound, and it starts to sound quite unnatural and digital and full of artifacts that you might describe as being bubbly or unusual. So don't go too extreme with your effects. Use the presets to guide you, and when in doubt, err on the side of it being more noisy and natural as opposed to being too processed and unnatural. When applying effects in the audio track mixer, like I say, these effects will apply across the entire track, which is a really smart way of applying effects economically across loads of clips. Alternatively, a lot of people apply effects onto clips manually by dragging and dropping, or they might select a lot of clips and sort of drag them on to all of them, or you sometimes see people copying. I do this more for video, but for copying an effect and pasting the attribute of that effect onto another clip, and you can choose which attributes of one clip go into the other. So this is good for doing color grading and all sorts of video effects, but you can use it for audio as well. It depends if you want an effect on individual clips or all of them. So you might decide that if you want some effects on certain clips, you might select the clip and apply it just to those clips. But if you want to apply effects across an entire track, it is very smart to use the audio track mixer to do that, because these effects here will apply all across this track here, which we've named DX for dialogue. So bear that in mind. Just want to show you the audio clip mixer, which is here, just to try and remove a bit of confusion that some people have around this. The audio clip mixer will show you the volume for whichever clip is selected as determined by where the scrubber is positioned. That is determined by where the scrubber is positioned in the timeline. So if I change the volume here, that changes the volume for the clip that I have selected as determined by that scrubber position. But you can also do that by clicking and dragging the line here, and that will update the fader position there. So you don't really need to use the audio clip mixer view. I just think it's more likely to cause you to accidentally change the volume of a clip or something. So I would actually avoid using the audio clip mixer view, really. You can do it, like I say, by clicking and dragging these volume automation lines. Now that takes us back to the effects track mixer, because quite often I see people going to town with keyframes, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with the odd keyframe. I quite like keyframing and automation. It's a smart way to get things done. And you can see keyframes in the effect control view for volume in this instance, because that's what I've just punched in with the pen tool. But if you find yourself punching in hundreds of volume keyframes, you're sort of wasting your time, because you want to be spending time doing more creative, fun stuff when it comes to storytelling. You don't want to be just sort of clicking and losing the will to live on Premiere here. So I want to show you a very useful effect called a compressor. Now, if you don't know what a compressor is, or you haven't used a compressor, I'm going to try and explain it in a very simple way, because it can be a bit confusing. Essentially, what a compressor does is it reduces the difference between the loudest part and the quietest part of a wave. So it reduces what we call the dynamic range. And it's a great way of reducing the volume of the louder parts, but leaving the quieter parts alone. And how it does that is essentially using a parameter called a threshold, which is essentially the volume level that it begins to reduce that volume. So you have to tell it where you want it to start affecting the volume in terms of reducing that volume. Let's just say at minus 20 dB. It's always good to use the numpad, type in minus 20 and then enter the numpad. The best way to enter values, good way to work. And then when the audio reaches minus 20 dB, it will begin to reduce the audio over that amount. So it's just reducing the louder parts of the signal and leaving the quiet part unaffected. And in order to reduce the volume over that amount, you need to tell it to reduce by a ratio. So a ratio of, let's say, a ratio of 3 would mean that for every 3 decibels the audio increases above that threshold, it actually only increases by 1, because it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So whatever number you see there, that to 1, that higher that ratio is, the more extreme the reduction of volume will be above that threshold. And you need to remember to turn it on, and you should see some gain reduction. This will show you when the compressor is reducing the volume above that point at that ratio. So without going too deep into compressors, I'll just show you how it works in real time. That's just showing that it's peaking, which isn't good. Hopefully that was just internal software distortion, not location actual clipping into the audio recorder, which is more of an issue, which you'd need Audition to fix. If you see peaking here, sometimes it's just because you're running it too hot in Premiere itself. But you can see, I'm going to play this, and I'm going to increase the compression by reducing the threshold as it plays, and you'll start to hear it working by reducing the loud parts of the wave. It's not a very dynamic recording here. You can see there's a lot of noise floor and there's just a few peaks. But if I just play this back, you'll hear it working. Again, you can go too far with the compressor and you can start to hear it working, which would distract you from the story, but also unintelligible high dynamic range dialogue can also distract you from the story. So it's about serving the story and trying to keep it as natural sounding as possible. So you've noticed that I've put the compressor, which is part of the dynamics effect, in the slot there, but I've left a gap because usually you put EQ before compression. There's a bit of a logical way to apply effects. And EQ, of course, we know is the division of sound into its component frequencies, which means we can change the volume of the signal, not by the total volume, but by individual frequency bands, which correspond to the low bass noise, mid-range, which is the body of the sound, and the high frequencies, which provide all the intelligibility. For example, I'm using a lavalier microphone at the moment, or a tie clip, and the high frequencies are important in terms of determining what I'm saying, making it intelligible, but the low frequencies give it a sort of warmth if you're listening back on speakers that can provide low frequencies, whereas the mids will provide the body and the tone, and again add to the sort of intelligibility of the sound. So usually you want to put an equalizer before a compressor, but that's up for debate in music particularly. So you have noise reduction first, then you have some EQ, then you might have some compression or some dynamics, and then after that you might have time-based effects or reverb or delays, things like that. So there is a bit of a logical order in using effects in a rack. And bear in mind as well that each individual channel of audio, each track or channel or microphone, will run through the master fader. It's quite smart to leave the fader positions at 0, which we call unity gain. You don't want to have crazy faders all over the place. So try to leave your faders at 0 and control the gain through effects. It's a smarter way to work, or you could just you could just click and drag the clip volume like that. The master channel will take all of the individual channels, and of course you can apply effects on the master channel too. So anything you put on the master channel in terms of dynamics or any of these effects whatsoever, and one that is quite handy is special mastering, because it's sort of got some options for loudness maximizing, which is boosting the loudness of your clip if it's quite soft. We don't want any EQ there on the master channel. We don't really want any reverb or any excitement or any widening. So just be aware of what you're doing. Be very selective when using effects. Try not to use too many crazy presets, because it will basically process your audio outside of your awareness. It's not really good. And when you're running effects, it's a really good idea to turn them off and on to compare them when they're working against when they're not. We call this A-Bing. You can see that it also, it's the same thing here. That's another bypass button there to A-B your effect on and off. So quite a smart way of applying effects on the master channel would be perhaps applying a bit of loudness maximizing only if you need to, some sort of gain-based process, followed by a limiter which acts as a ceiling. It's sort of like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, you shall not pass over this amount, and that should be in the amplitude and compression section, hard limiter. Double click that hard limiter, or we can control it here, but I don't really like this, like I say. That hard limiter maximum amplitude will not pass beyond that amount, which means you do not hit 0 dB, which is the point of pain. So I would always use a hard limiter on the master channel in Premiere or my audio application, which is a brick wall limiter. And you can set it to peak or true peak. It's probably a good idea to set it to true peak at -1 decibel, which is -1 enter. As per BBC technical specification recommendations, BBC won't accept your content if it goes beyond that point. They'll scan and deny your hard-worked footage. So there are some presets as well. There's -3, which is a recommendation by the BBC. -1 is an absolute limit for the BBC, but -3 is their recommendation. And do refer to Moodle Media Arts Skills Centre. I've actually linked the BBC documents I'm referring to here, or come speak to me about this if you're not sure. But this is very important to prevent output clipping or distortion. And another really handy effect I would put on the master channel, particularly at the very end, would be a loudness radar, which shows you over time. It's like a histogram over time. It gives you a reading of round about where your average loudness is. In order to read this properly, we want to set it to European settings of loudness units full scale, which shows us where we want in a -23 region up front. This is round about where you want your dialogue sitting in this region. Loud noises will of course creep up. Loud sound effects or perhaps a music segment might creep up, but just be aware of fatigue. It's something that I think less people are aware of now because we're uploading to web and there's no real standard about YouTube or in terms of loudness and fatigue, whereas on TV it's a much bigger deal because broadcasters don't want you switching away from their channel if the volume is all over the place. On the TV shows or movie shows, they want it to be consistent. They want to reduce customers essentially leaving them, volume surfing or channel surfing to other broadcasters. So that's important. That would be a rough approach to inserting effects using the audio track mixer expansion view here. It's so easy to miss this. I think Adobe should really make more of a thing about this because people just don't use this. It's a great shame because you're missing that functionality of inserting effects across an entire channel, and you're more likely to sort of do things the long roundabout way. So Adobe have included a new feature into Premiere called Essential Sound, and I personally wouldn't use this in its current manifestation because it's kind of increasing more room for confusion, I would say. I prefer to add effects manually here and then have those effects visible on the clip in the effect control view, and you're individually choosing what effect to apply there. You're not just putting a sort of blanket dialogue approach. The effect sound, the way it's built is almost like a bit of a barrier. It allows you to apply effects in such a way that you can't really see what's going on under the hood. It's a bit of a block between your decision-making process and the actual end result. I mean, you can see what it's applied if you go in through the effect controls. I've just very haphazardly applied these effects there. And you can sort of manually bypass or remove them if you like. But it's just good to be aware of what this does because I think this will eventually grow into a very powerful, useful feature. The idea is that, let's say you've got all different types of clips on a track. So I've labeled this dialogue, but let's just pretend that we've got sound effects, ambient, background noise, and dialogue all on the same track. This feature, Essential Sound, allows you to assign a designation, an audio type, to a selection of clips. So you might say, these are dialogue clips, these are music, and these are sound effects and ambience. I don't think that's the best way to work. I think you should be manually putting those clips on tracks that are named in such a way instead. But who am I to tell you what to do? I can only recommend. One reason this might be super useful that I can think of that you might want to use it is because you can use a feature called audio ducking, which essentially reduces the volume of one clip based upon another clip's dialogue. So, for example, if you have dialogue and you've got music playing in the background, you might want to tell the music clip to momentarily reduce in volume because you want that dialogue clip to be understood without the audio being so high in the background. Personally, I would do that in Adobe Audition. It's easier to have more control over that ducking process. But I very much would like to encourage you to experiment. So if you want to use that, by all means do, and let me know and come and show me what you've done. And it would be nice to see this essential sound being used in a creative way. I'm going to close it for now because remember, it's just a bit more careful to apply effects individually to clips or entire tracks. And if you are applying effects onto clips, you know, if you wanted to, you could create presets. You can create audio effect presets. So if I call this, let's say, matte EQ, and I save that, that preset is now, all the effects that were in this audio effects preset will now be bundled in. So you can apply loads of effects and they'll all be saved in one preset that you can then drag and drop onto one clip or a number of clips if you have them all highlighted, or indeed as you wish. So that's really handy to know that. It just means that you've got more manual control over what's going on at the clip level. And another option to bear in mind is you can right-click on a clip and you can open the clip in Audition and you can process it more powerfully there. In Audition, when you make a save in the clip view, it will destructively overwrite that source clip, so that should update it automatically in Premiere. However, those of you who are thinking more long-term, you'll be essentially working towards a picture lock. You won't be doing any audio processing in Premiere. You'll just be cutting up your timeline, getting everything synced, organizing things, naming tracks. Then once you're ready for the sound edit, once you've got your picture lock, and only when you have your picture lock, you will be right-clicking on your sequence and you will be editing the entire sequence in Audition. And you'll be working on all the audio there and exporting it down to a stereo WAV at 48 kilohertz at 24 bits, which is our pro audio format, and you'll be pulling it back into Premiere or perhaps pulling it into DaVinci for your kind of finishing or your mastering stage. But I just want to bear in mind that I just want to highlight the fact that a lot of people don't do the jump into Audition or Logic or Pro Tools until the picture is locked, and that causes a lot of issues. If you make that transition before you have a picture lock, you're potentially causing huge sync issues as the picture continues to be cut in your NLE, your video program, if the audio is already set as a certain sequence in your audio application. So in other words, it can cause massive incompatibilities between different programs, massive headaches, and I will just say that that should be a one-time jump into your audio, digital audio workstation, your DAW. It should be a one-time jump in after you've picture locked only, and then it should be, well, you can export back multiple times if you're working on the audio, but it should be a one-time hop. So that being said, we're going to move on past effects now because there's so many effects to talk about, and it's just good to generally be aware of compression and EQ as a starting point and to have a general awareness of the order that you put them in. So in Audition, you would have much more powerful sound restoration, noise removal features. You do have some level of control here, but Audition has spectral frequency views and all sorts of more powerful options for capturing noise prints and sound prints and more advanced stuff. But also you might choose to go into Logic as well, or instead of Audition. Logic is really powerful for doing sound design and for composing, scoring original audio as you're doing your mix, but you might miss some of the more Adobe-based noise restoration and removal features that you might find in Audition if you're in Logic, because Logic's noise removal isn't quite there, and it's the same for well, Pro Tools. Other programs rely on third-party plugins such as isotope, to remove the noise. So just be aware that there's a reason why you might choose to go into Audition versus Logic. In order to help the process of exporting video into other applications, let's say I want to see the video here so that I can cut the sound to picture in Audition, because when you make that jump, it doesn't actually bring across the picture. It just pulls up the entire sequence audio-wise in Audition, but it's nice to have the video as well. So bear in mind that whoever is cutting your audio, they should be running off the same time code just to make sure that everything's nice and synchronized. There should also be a Academy leader, usually a 30-second count-in and a 2-pop, which is a burst of 1 kilohertz tone for 1 frame, 2 seconds before your first frame of action. And with video, your first frame of action is usually on the 1 hour point. That comes from the age of film reels. Reel number 1 would be dropped on the 1 hour mark. This is actually minutes, not hours. And reel 2 would go on the 2 hour point, reel 3 on the 3 hour point, and so forth. So if you need to, you can set the start time of your sequence just by clicking that there. And you can manually punch in, let's say, the 1 hour minus 30 seconds of leading in time would be 59 minutes and 30 seconds. But I just want to show you how useful it is to create a timecode stamp burned into the video for your sound editor to help them stay in sync with you, which helps you as well. New item, transparent video. That's going to be 1920 by 1080 HD, 25 frames a second square pixels. That's going to generate a transparent video, which you can then drag and drop and expand all across your timeline. And in effects, there's a great video effect, which is important for sound, called timecode. Drag and drop on transparent video, it appears. Go into your effect controls with transparent video selected, remove the field symbol, and you can manually generate, timecode source generate, manually generate your timecode. And that just means that whoever's working on the video in sound can see exactly what the frame count is, 25 frames a second. So maybe you can stay in sync, or you can talk about what's going on over the phone while you're both looking at the same file with the timestamp, because people can sometimes use different rulers or meters of time depending on which programs they're using, although you should be working from timecode in Logic at 25 frames as well. It is worth bearing in mind that to check the sequence settings before you deliver a file for someone else is quite key. You're running from 25 frames a second, and your sample rate should always be pro sample rate, which is 48 kilohertz. So very important there, because whoever is picking it up, it needs to be in the same settings, essentially, otherwise they might have issues. So with the jump to Audition, you know, you right click here and it's kind of doing all the work for you. So you're not really aware that it's carrying across as a dynamic link XML file. But if you have to go into Logic or another program, you soon realize that you need to be quite particular about which format you're using. Now, if you want to send a multi-channel encoded file to Logic or Pro Tools, you're going to be using an AAF or an OMF. So an AAF is slightly more intelligent in the sense that if you've done some, let's say some keyframes or some fading, or which you shouldn't really do, that should be the job of the audio person in the audio application. But if you do have metadata or additional work done, AAF is much more likely to carry that work across into the recipient application, whereas OMF likely won't carry across a lot of that work. So just be careful, and when in doubt, just do a test transfer. I think you don't want to be waiting until you're actually working on a big important session. Just do a little test transfer from one application to another and check if it carries across some of your work, some of your fading. Otherwise, you just might be losing a whole load of time. So AAF can embed video for the person who's doing the sound edit, but I think it's much easier to send them the video manually than you're sending them the audio. It just makes life easier. To export the audio in the AAF format, there are some settings here that you need to be really careful on. Otherwise, you'll have massive issues. And one of those settings is breakout to mono should be enabled. And the files should be set to separate audio. Otherwise, picking them up, you might have huge headaches with your, let's say your Logic. It'll just receive the audio files in a very jumbled up way that won't make much sense to you, and you'll have less control over the files unless you have enabled this. These options will help you massively. So always break it to mono. It just gives you the most amount of control in your other application there. So highly recommended. And it will then prompt you, whoops, I almost forgot to set the bits to 24. Always sample rate 48 kilohertz, bits per sample 24 bits. Keep those settings as per your recording device should be set to that as well. And I can see that if I actually look in my audio options, it's 48 kilohertz and 24 bits if you expand along. So stick to what you recorded in, and you should decide these things in advance of your project. What's your frame rate going to be? What's your sample rate and your bits per sample? Very important for interoperability between different applications. Okay, you will then get a pop-up asking you where you want your AAF, and you're going to want to put that on the server, and then Logic you're going to import from that location, and it will bring in the audio files in a multi-channel format, all as mono files. And you might get some errors with the video because it struggles to encode the video into an AF file, but that's okay because we usually encode video separately for someone who's doing a sound mix. Usually we would set it to QuickTime. We don't want to click this one. That's a bit of a banana skin that gets people out sometimes. Set the format to QuickTime, and this is the file format. So the QuickTime file format contains a video codec and an audio codec. The video codec, we usually want to push that to Apple ProRes 422 proxy. That will give you the best sort of quality to size ratio. And here is where you click match source. See, this is set to like a lower, more standard, sort of discontinued aspect ratio, or should I say pixel count. I want to match the source pixel count, which is going to be 1920 by 1080, or at least it should be. Here it's gone to another, it's actually gone to an incorrect frame rate as well, because we're actually running off the wrong piece of footage. So that's because that is selected there. I'm going to select Basla's footage from the sequence here, and I'm going to export again, and QuickTime ProRes 422 proxy. Now the source should be determined by the correct footage, which is 1080. So you can see 1920 by 1080 there, and the frame rate is correct. It's not gone to some strange American standard like the previous clip had. It's progressive, it's square pixels, and it's all good. And the audio settings should be 48 kilohertz there and 24 bits. This is our end-to-end workflow, and this will give us better dynamic range basically, but just stick to it all the time when you're not sure. And it's uncompressed, and then but like I say, this is just for the video post, so that the video can be viewed with timecode in the audio application, and we simply export that, and it's going to run off the file there. So nice to have timecode. Work together, talk to each other, communicate, check your settings in advance of embarking on your project, understand what you can do in Premiere, and then you may decide it's not enough for you, you need more advanced features elsewhere, or you want to do a bit of scoring in Logic. You might be using Premiere for the first year, but I really think that you should be moving into audio programs in the second and third year. It's going to set you up for life, really. But while you're in Premiere, this way of working here will keep you nice and fast and speedy, and you'll be spending more time delivering a really engaging story and less time fighting with keyframes and working against things that could be smoother. So I hope this helps. I would like to mention again, the audio post document on Moodle, the Media Arts Skills Center, is full of guidelines in terms of volume amounts, in terms of best practices for both video and audio. There's a lot of information there, and just do come and talk to me if you're not sure about why you might be going one way or the other, or how to best apply some settings. And that's pretty much it for today. So I hope you found this useful, and do let me know if you want me to pick up on any of these topics in future videos, and I'll look at them more specifically in detail. Thanks.